Thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from July 7th, 2019. Join us as we continue our study in the life of Joseph with Pastor Dax.
Okay, so we are in Genesis 45, verse 16 through chapter 46, verse 4. Sometimes the way that the chapters are divided up in Scripture don't really match up with the flow of the story, so we're making some shifts on that. But I hope that it's been as encouraging for you as it has been for me in this time in Genesis to see the godly character of Joseph revealed over and over again, especially the way that Joseph has embraced God's providence, particularly in the midst of the suffering that he's endured. And in this case, like we saw last week, how God has brought good to the very people who caused Joseph to suffer. There's such a clear parallel there to what Jesus accomplished. And last week, we saw that play out in chapter 45, the first 15 verses. Remember that sort of shocking reunion as Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers, and then he stated his sound theology in trusting God and his providence, and then he presented this pressing strategy to them that required action on their part, but he also promised to protect them and to provide for them if they could come down to Egypt. And the big point from last week was that it was Joseph's embrace of God's providence that allowed him to overcome any bitterness or resentment that he rightfully would have had toward his brothers. Joseph knew that God was working through his pain. Someone put it like this: because all pain is God-filtered, we can be sure that it is purpose-filled. The point for Joseph wasn't about who did wrong to whom and why and where to cast blame. His focus was on seeing God's purposes behind all the things he went through, because he trusted that God was working all of these things together for good. And so today we're going to continue looking at the surprising ways that God works for the good of his people. And here's our big idea for this morning. This is what I want you to see, is that the providential means that God uses to accomplish his saving purposes are often as mysterious as the glorious end to which they lead. And we're going to see that unfold in two big scenes this morning. Number one, a generous provision from Pharaoh. That'll be chapter 45, verses 16 through 24. And then secondly, we'll see that in a stunning report to Jacob from verse 25 through 46, verse 4. So let's look at this first scene here, a generous provision from Pharaoh. We'll start in verse 16, chapter 45. When the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers have come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. So this all started when Pharaoh's servants heard Joseph's uncontrollable weeping after he dismissed them from the room. Remember that back in chapter 45, verse 2? But now there's been this family reunion with him and his brothers. It's been made known, and we're told that Pharaoh and the Egyptians are glad. They're glad about this for Joseph's sake. This is what Family Sunday is all about. We just roll with it. We love it. Have you been to churches where there's no babies, no crying? I'd much rather have crying babies every day. So we are fine with that. But did you hear what I said? Are you tracking with me? That's the only downside. What we see here in this first verse 16, right, is that the report goes out to Pharaoh's house. It started when Joseph had dismissed all the servants from the room, and they heard his weeping from outside the room, but now it's been made known that this reunion has happened and everybody's happy. Pharaoh and his household are happy for Joseph. In fact, Pharaoh is so pleased to hear about this, and his affection for Joseph is so strong that he could hardly have replied in a way that is more extravagant and more generous than how he actually does. Look at verse 17. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts and go back to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat the fat of the land. That's an amazing promise that Pharaoh makes. Don't forget the chronology here. We are still on the front end of a severe famine. And Pharaoh offers Joseph's family the best of the land to settle into and to work. A literal oasis in the desert. And this is important for Pharaoh to do this because Joseph has already offered the land of Goshen to his family in the last chapter, which he has the right to do as the prime minister of Egypt. But there is one man over Joseph, Pharaoh, right, who retains veto power, and if he calls it off, there's no deal. But Pharaoh here, he's not only willing to give the best of the land to Joseph's family, he's going to mobilize resources to transport the family and their belongings down to Egypt. Verse 19. And you, Joseph, are commanded to say, do this. Take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. So you see here, Pharaoh's not just spitting out empty words, right? He is putting a visible pledge out there to back up his promise. Wagons. Now, we hear wagons, right? And we think of kind of a rickety, rustic sort of means of transportation. Wagons are what peasants use to get around out in the wilderness. But that's not the case here. This is a world where people had to walk on foot. At best, they had a donkey or some sort of beast of burden to lead that could carry the load for them. So a wagon would be luxurious. And these were no doubt the finest wagons of the day coming from Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh's generous provision extends even further. So beyond a promise to give the family the best of the land, beyond the visible pledge of sending the wagons to help bring them there, now Pharaoh says in verse 20, have no concern for your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Don't even worry about bringing your stuff, right? We'll set you up here when you arrive. Just hop in the wagons. They're nice. Enjoy the trip down. We'll take care of the rest when you get here. Now, there's nothing in the text to suggest that Pharaoh is anything other than sincere and kind and exceedingly generous in this offer for Joseph's family. However, knowing the rest of the story, there are a couple of dark clouds floating behind this silver lining. The first dark cloud is that even in Pharaoh's kindness to Joseph and to Jacob and the rest of the family to invite them down to Egypt, this is a turning point in the big story, isn't it? This is the beginning of the fulfillment of what happened in Genesis 15, where God spoke to Abraham and he said, know, Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. And so we see that God's providence prepares the way for God's providence. The genuine, authentic generosity of Pharaoh is setting up centuries of suffering for the Israelites. But meaningful and necessary suffering, because Egypt will serve as the incubator in which the people of Israel are kept pure and will grow and will emerge as a nation. And so in verse 21, we see Joseph and the brothers do what Pharaoh has commanded them to do. The sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons according to the command of Pharaoh and gave them provisions for the journey. Presumably these provisions were also at the command of Pharaoh, and what provisions they are. Verse 22, to each and all of them he gave a change of clothes, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 changes of clothes. To his father he sent as follows, 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provision for his father on the journey. Now, it may not seem like that big of a deal that he gave them each a change of clothes. But these were not ordinary blue-collar shepherd clothes. These were very likely royal garments, much like the robe that they had ripped away from him back when they were so jealously angry at him all those years before. And so this is a meaningful, significant gift, and it demonstrates remarkable forgiveness on the part of Joseph to give to his brothers what they ripped away from him. And moreover, Benjamin again is favored. He's given 5 changes of clothes, 300 shekels of silver, that's around 7 pounds. Joseph continues to pour out favor on his younger brother. And the beauty here is that there's no hint of jealousy or envy from the other brothers, which is a remarkable sign, once again, of the transformation that they have experienced throughout this whole process. Joseph does not fear to send Benjamin off with them. That's big. And how was Joseph able to do all of this, to make this provision for his family? Well, at a very human level, he had found favor in Pharaoh's eyes. He'd received grace from Pharaoh, demonstrated in Pharaoh's amazing promise, I will give you, your family, the best of the land in Egypt, and then backed up by a pledge to send wagons to bring them there. But however wonderful it is that Joseph found favor in the king of Egypt's eyes, it is far more wonderful for you to find favor in the eyes of the King of Kings. Because Jesus promises his followers a much better land than what Pharaoh could offer. Remember in John's gospel, Jesus says, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and I will take you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And then Jesus backs up that greater promise with a much greater pledge than wagons. Jesus offers the pledge of the Holy Spirit to believers, which Ephesians tells us that the Spirit is the guarantee of our inheritance until we acquire possession of it. And just as Pharaoh sent provisions for the journey, Jesus provides for our needs in a much greater way. Give us this day our daily bread. And think about this. Why was it that Pharaoh was so kind to Joseph's brothers? Was it because of who they were and what they had done? No, if they deserved anything from Pharaoh, it was punishment, likely death, because of their crime against Joseph. So why did Pharaoh show them favor then? It was for Joseph's sake. Do you see how the same thing is true for us here? God doesn't save us because of who we are or because of what we've done. If we deserve anything from God, it's punishment. Rightly so, even death, because of our crimes against his son. But an even greater display of grace than what Pharaoh gives to Joseph's brothers, God extends saving grace to all of those who are brothers and sisters of his son, Jesus Christ. We're saved by grace. That's what favor is. Grace. Grace is God's favor to those who deserve death. And we can only be presented to the Father by Jesus Christ because it is he who always found favor in the eyes of his Father. It is he who enables us to find favor with God as well through him. And then Joseph makes this interesting little remark in verse 24. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, do not quarrel on the way. He's already instructed his brothers, right? Tell dad that I'm alive. Tell him that I am the prime minister of Egypt. Hurry, get home, bring him down here. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to provide for you. I have a place for you. I'll even get you here. Oh, and by the way, no fighting on the way home. Why would he throw that in? Now, I believe that these men are changed at this point in the story. But a week or two together in the desert, traveling, would have been the perfect environment for some old sinful behaviors to resurface. They've experienced this incredible reunion. They've experienced this profound forgiveness from Joseph. But there are some significant things that they are going to still have to process and go through. How are they going to react once they're out of Joseph's presence and they're left to their own devices? Are they going to try to assign blame and justify themselves for their sin against Joseph all those years ago? See, this is the second dark cloud in the story. Because the process of repentance and humiliation for these brothers is not finished yet. Why? Because the good news that they're bringing home with them is going to require a full confession to their father, Jacob. Can you imagine? After seeing how the grief and heartache that they had caused had traumatized their father for over 20 years, after carrying the burden of that guilt for so long, to now stand before their father and say, Joseph is alive, and we need to tell you something. See, that prospect is looming over their heads. And so you can imagine the conversations and possible arguments on the way home. Reuben might have said, remember, I tried to save Joseph. I told you not to kill him, and I came back to get him, and you guys had already sold him off. And Judah might have piped in and said, well, hey, you guys were going to kill him. At least I talked you out of that, and we sold him off. I spared his life. Now, there's no indication that any of that actually happened, but Joseph's wise counsel and advice here acknowledged the possibility that it could. And so he says, do not quarrel on the way. And I want to try to make this part just a little more practical for us. So very briefly here, by way of application, here are 3 principles for us to apply in Joseph's warning to his brothers. So here's the first principle that we can take away from this little part of the story. Number 1, forgiving someone's sin does not necessarily mean naively disregarding their sinful tendencies. Forgiving someone's sin doesn't necessarily mean naively disregarding their sinful tendencies. Now, we are not to hold someone's confessed sin over their head as leverage. That's not forgiveness. On the other hand, it would be foolish to pretend that someone's sinful track record doesn't exist. Joseph knows his brothers. He knows their sinful tendencies, including their tendency to blame each other. They've changed, yes, they're not perfect. And so even as he extends forgiveness to them, he also admonishes them to not give in to their sinful tendencies. That's one principle. Number 2, confronting sinful tendencies in others doesn't require bringing up sin that's already been repented of. Confronting sin in others does not require bringing up sin that they've already repented of. Notice Joseph doesn't go on a lengthy diatribe here to talk about his brother's sinful past and everything they'd done. Instead, he encourages them to look forward and to move past their old sin by simply saying, do not quarrel on the way home. He remembers what they've done, but he doesn't rub their faces in it because they've repented of it. The message is, leave the past in the past and go forward now with the new character that God has given you. And then a third thing that we can learn from this little warning of Joseph here is that a Christian, a peacemaker, works for reconciliation among all parties. A Christian is to work for reconciliation among all parties. Joseph worked hard himself to make peace with his brothers, but he doesn't stop there. He recognizes that there's this tension still between them as they've been sinning against their father and sinning amongst each other for 22 years. So Joseph isn't just interested in working for his own peace with them, but he wants to see his brothers blessed by also coming to a peaceful relationship among themselves and with their father. That's not normal for us, is it? To seek that. To pursue peace between other people. You've seen this kind of thing. I know you have. Maybe in the workplace. Maybe in the church. People who are nice and friendly to each other one day, but the next day they're talking behind their back, driving a wedge. That's our natural tendency, isn't it? To create division, to create rifts, to tear people down. But that's not what Christians are called to do. Christians must work for peace, not just for you and the other person, they must work for peace among all people. So, 3 little freebie principles there out of that statement. But notice here how God has really worked in this remarkable and unexpected way in Joseph's family through this generous provision from Pharaoh. And we're reminded here, this is what we're trying to take in, that the providential means that God uses to accomplish his saving purposes are often as mysterious and surprising as the glorious end to which they lead. And that brings us to the second scene here now. The next means of God's surprising providence. It's a stunning report to Jacob. Verse 25. So they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. And they told him, Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. Now, as I said, there is necessarily a lot more that they had to say at this point to their father. We're not told how that went. We are given Jacob's reaction to all of this. And his heart became numb, for he did not believe them. We can understand this, I think. The realization, as it sinks in, that there have been decades of sin and deceit from his sons, all of the resulting trauma and grief that goes along with that. Most recently, his fear of losing Benjamin even plays into this. All of those things now collide, causing him not only to be unable to rejoice at the good news that his sons have brought home, but to be unable to believe it at all. Not only can he not rejoice, he can't even believe it. And this is how we are too. It's interesting how we choose what we want to believe. Not just that our faith wavers sometimes, but how so often we are more inclined to believe bad news. We're more inclined to believe the worst in someone or something, much more than we are good news. That's certainly been the pattern in Jacob's life. He had easily believed the lie that Joseph was killed without hardly any investigation. And now he refuses to believe the truth that Joseph is alive. It's very similar to when Jesus died on the cross, remember? Word spread quickly. All of the disciples had no trouble believing that he was dead and buried. The bad news was quite believable. But when the good news came to them from the women who had went out early to the tomb, that Jesus' body was no longer there, that angels had appeared to them to say that he was risen, they couldn't believe that. And this is how many people react to the gospel, which is the good news. That God sent his son Jesus to save sinners by dying in their place and rising from the dead, that Jesus has gone to prepare a place for them and he will one day return to be with them forever. And so you must repent of your sin and trust in Jesus Christ, because he will receive anyone who comes to him and never cast them out. Does that news sound too good to be true? My unbelieving friend, is this your perspective? Does all of this sound like fantasy and fairy tales? Are you so wrapped up in yourself, so disheartened by your circumstances, so discouraged by your sin that you cannot bring yourself to believe the good news of the gospel? You need to open this book and ask God to reveal the truth of the gospel, and then you need to believe it and be saved. Jacob's initial reaction to this good news is like his heart froze up. Like life wasn't real. He couldn't accept it. Verse 27 says, "But when they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, 'It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die.'" The light of the truth has a way of pushing through the darkness, and it demands a response of belief. Jacob was confronted with the personal testimony of his sons. They told him all the words of Joseph. Yes, all the promises of provision that Joseph had made for them, but also what Joseph had told them earlier regarding his conviction that God was behind all of this. Remember? God sent me, God sent me, God sent me, he says. And then interestingly, when Jacob lays his eyes on the wagons that had been sent, he moves from this gloomy unbelief to a joyful acceptance of the truth that his son was still alive. That pledge, those wagons, had its intended effect. It's a foretaste of Joseph's words. It's a down payment, if you will. And it warms Jacob's heart, it revives his spirit, and he is able to believe the truth. And did you notice the name change that takes place there in verse 28? And Israel said, "It is enough." That's significant. As Jacob gives expression to his renewed faith, the covenant name that God gave him, Israel, is used. See, throughout most of the story, when Jacob's in charge, when we get this self-pitying, hard-hearted, complaining, feel sorry for himself kind of person, but when he yields to God, we get Israel, who rises up and steps out in faith. And we can't underestimate the faith being exercised by Israel here. Think about it. God had promised this land of Canaan, the land that Israel and his family were already living in. He'd promised it to his grandfather and to his father, to him, to their descendants forever. And now he's being asked by Joseph to leave the land of promise behind at an advanced age, knowing that he's not going to return alive. And I think this is part of God's perfect providence in this situation, because perhaps the only thing that could have torn Israel away from the promised land was the possibility of seeing his favored son Joseph again. Not many of us like change, right? And I think the older we get, the more true that is. And we can understand that Jacob might be reluctant to leave. This is the land God promised me. This is where I'm supposed to be. I'm staying here. Yet he's heard the report of these words from his son. He sees the evidence of its truth right there in the wagons. Maybe he even remembers the dream that 17-year-old Joseph had shared with him all those years ago about how he himself would be bowing down to him. And so he arises in faith to God's revelation and to God's confirmation of it all, and he agrees to leave. And what we see here at this point in Israel's life is a reminder that faith does not have an expiration date. If I can speak to my older brothers and sisters in Christ, those of you with gray hair or less hair than me, you never get to an age where you no longer have to trust God, or you no longer have things to learn, or obstacles to overcome, or fears to face, or doubts to wrestle, or sin to kill. Faith is a lifelong activity. You don't retire from it. As long as there is blood coursing through your veins, as long as there is air in your lungs, you must stand ready to grow and act in faith. So don't feel like you are sidelined in the church. You have much to offer. But even with Israel's joyful declaration of faith here, Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. There's still a question that's left to be answered. And the question is Joseph right about this? I mean, is it God's will for Israel to pick up his whole family, everything that he has, and come to Egypt? Because remember, twice before, both with Abraham and with Isaac, it had been proven to be an unfaithful, bad idea for them to go to Egypt. In fact, God had specifically forbidden Isaac from going to Egypt when he planned to do that. So is this really what God intends? Yeah, Pharaoh's made this generous offer, but should Jacob accept it? That's the question. Is this God's will for Jacob in his old age, when he's already living in the land that God has promised? Or is he just acting selfishly and sentimentally in wanting to see his favorite son. That's the tension that we have as we come to chapter 46. Look at verse 1. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Bear Sheva and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. So he begins his journey, but then he stops at Bear Sheva to offer sacrifices. Why Bear Sheva? Well, this is a significant place in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 21, Bear Sheva was where Abraham had made a covenant with some Philistines to secure the possession of a well. He named the place Bear Sheva. It means well of the oath. And Abraham worshiped God at that place because he had provided this well for him and his family. And then later in chapter 26, Isaac also worships God at Beer Sheva, being assured of God's blessings in this nighttime vision that he had. In fact, this is where the family was living when Jacob had to flee from Esau in Beer Sheva. And even though Jacob had left that place, this is still a meaningful location for him and his family. And so verse 1 says that he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Beer Sheva, if you know where it is, it's on the southern border in the desert in Israel. It's perched there on the edge of the promised land. And Jacob had never ventured past that place, because beyond it lay the desert wilderness and then Egypt. And so despite his resolve, his newfound faith to go, he still has some justifiable concerns here. And so Jacob seeks God by offering sacrifices to him. And I want you to think about this. For all of Jacob's miserable failures, this is an amazing demonstration of trust and obedience on his part. Now, I'm sure that his worship included confession of sin, thanksgiving for God's provision, thanksgiving for Joseph being alive. But mostly, I think, given the context here, Jacob is worshiping God to seek his guidance in this. These sacrifices are a way of saying to God, I trust you, I believe your promises, I believe that my family will live in the land of Canaan like you have said, but it seems like you're leading me to go to Egypt right now. These sacrifices are a testimony of his belief in God and God's promises. Now, this worship of God isn't going to make God's commitment to love him and bless him and keep his promises any greater than it already is, but God can use this worship from Jacob as a means of sanctifying grace in his life to remind Jacob of who God is and of his love for him. And God knows that Jacob needs some assurance. This is a big decision. To stay in Canaan is to guarantee significant hardship, possibly starvation, or at least the possibility of having to send people back and forth to be able to get food so people can live. But to go to Egypt is an apparent step away from God's stated purposes and promises that Jacob and his family would live there. And so we see God show up and reveal himself lovingly to Jacob in the midst of this worship. Verse 2, and God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. He calls out to him by name, right? Reminding us that God is a personal God who knows us. And he said, here am I. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. God reaffirms the covenant with Jacob by reminding him that he is the same God of Isaac, the same God of Abraham. He can be trusted to keep his word. Then he says, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. God reiterates this same promise made to Abraham, to Isaac, now to Jacob, to make his descendants into a great, mighty nation. And then comes what I think are probably the most important words for Jacob in this moment. God says, I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hands shall close your eyes. God promises his presence to Jacob as he makes this journey to Egypt. He promises to be with him even in death. He promises to eventually bring him back to the promised land, and as icing on the cake, as a measure of his goodness and kindness, God promises that it will be his beloved son Joseph who will be there to close his eyes. God is assuring Jacob that his hand is in this, that he will not forsake his promises, that he's not just okay with Jacob going down to Egypt as a plan B, but that this is precisely the way that he will work out his purpose and blessing for him and his family. Can you imagine what an encouragement this would be for Jacob? It's like God is saying to him, hey, I know you're scared, I know you're uncertain, but I'm going to go with you. I will bless you. I will bring you back again. Even though not all of this makes sense to you, my love for you is true. It's strong. Nothing will shake it. Not this famine, not this apparent change of plans. I am working for you, Jacob, and I am with you to the end. It seems that in every way, God is working to help Jacob embrace this change in scenery. Not only does he have his beloved son Joseph waiting in Egypt to greet him, but also he has this tremendously generous provision made by Pharaoh. A provision that will allow his family to prosper and remain in Egypt even after the famine is over. That's important, right? So that this little seed of a nation we see here would gestate in the womb of Egypt and be delivered centuries later as a mightier nation for the purposes that God had for them. And when they return to Canaan 400 years from now, millions of people strong, it would be an inescapable testimony to God who did it all. The providential means that God uses to accomplish his saving purposes are often as mysterious as the glorious end to which they lead. In this passage, to assure Joseph's brothers, to assure Jacob, and to perfectly, powerfully, and sovereignly guide them to Egypt so that his purposes for them would be fulfilled. And think about this. God's words of encouragement here to Jacob would also have been an encouragement to the original readers of this book, the Hebrew nation, as they sit in the wilderness waiting to enter the promised land. Moses is the author of Genesis, and as they face this great challenge of their own, God's promise to Jacob is also God's promise to them. I will bring you back up again. And we too must trust in that same promise when we face our own daunting circumstances, when we see things that haven't gone according to our plan, when we find ourselves in our own little wildernesses, waiting to come to God's promised land, because God's covenant faithfulness to his people remains no matter how things appear. And he's already demonstrated that, hasn't he, perfectly, once and for all, in the death of his son. The cross was God's providential means to accomplish his saving purpose. And it is as beautifully mysterious as the glorious end that it secures. Jesus redeemed God's people in his death. After rising from the dead, he poured out the Spirit to give us new birth, to change us into his image. And now, with the indwelling Spirit, with his word as our guide, and with the gift of the church to each other, we know, we live in the reality that God is with us. Just as Jacob was encouraged by that promise, just as the Israelites would have been encouraged by that promise, so let us be encouraged by the promise that God is always with us through every twist and turn, supplying the grace that you need for each and every day. What does Jesus say in the Great Commission? I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And may God grant us the same faith to walk with him and to honor him as we see in Jacob right here. As Jacob worshiped, to be reminded of his covenant relationship with God, let us now continue to worship this same God who has brought us into a greater covenant through the blood of his one and only Son.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.